Hello, hello. Okay, good morning. We're going to talk about qualitative data analysis and interpretation, module 16 today. Let me get the PowerPoint going here. All right. Okay, wonderful. Welcome. Okay, last module. Okay, let's talk about qualitative data analysis and interpretation. Um, in many ways, this is probably one of the more difficult parts of qualitative research. But it really sort of depends on the amount of data that you have. Interpretation really requires some um, knowledge of theory and how it is that you're going to use theory to help you interpret the data that you have. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Okay, so the purpose um, of qualitative research is to collect data in a way that represents participants, feelings, culture, etc., or the phenomenon in which participants experience the world, and to be able to analyze and present it in a way that sheds light on whatever phenomenon is under investigation. So the analysis is a major stumbling block for novice researchers. It's difficult, it's time consuming, it's challenging, but arguably the most important part of qualitative research is analysis, given that this is sort of the final stage and really exposes what you found really to the world. I'm going to here show some examples of some projects that I was involved with that uh, show some data analysis. And again, sometimes to be able to find trends, you gotta put stuff in visual formats and qualitative. And that's sort of what we were attempting to do here with some of the examples. So this example was a study that we did on faculty. And so this here shows all the different themes that we found and how all the themes are connected to the sub-themes, etc. So the themes are in cap letters, uppercase, and the sub-themes will be in lowercase. And so this is really kind of a visual representation. This here shows the final output of all the findings that we had. Again, the yellow is the first level theme, and the white is the sub-themes. And this was an analysis of over 200 articles of research that we found. Again, this is just a small piece of it, but I wanted to show you sort of how we actually ultimately made sense of all of the data. And this is kind of the final result of that graphic and many other challenges. So as you see here, these challenges right in the middle there, challenges. When you get to here, the challenges are represented by the minuses that you see here. So when you see minus, that means that these are challenges. You got stuff at the department, institution, and national level, different challenges. And so this kind of ultimately from, probably hundreds of boxes that we have, ultimately that can't be represented very easily. So we do something like this, where it's one graphic and is much easier to represent something like this. Okay. Here's just another example. Okay. And just some more examples of, how you sort of represent the data. It's sort of a good analogy is sort of like a tree. You have the trunk, then you have the large branches. Connected to those are smaller branches. Connected to those may be leaves, etc. Right? There's many different levels. That's sort of a good way to look at sort of qualitative data analysis. But the only difference is that sometimes you don't know where the leaves go to what branches they go to. They can ultimately go to many different branches, but they may fit a little bit better in some branches than others. Okay. And this is just some more examples. This was from, I know I've talked about the Men and Boys of Color project that I've worked on in the past. And this is sort of an example of how we use theory, which is we use Latino critical theory, LACRIT. These are the different components of the theory up here and how they're connected. This is also part of the theory. how they're connected to all the voices, the Latino and the leader voices that we found, and all the different domains that we were really trying to interrogate and investigate for that study there. Here's another way. We tried different ways to try to represent it. Here was another attempt to try to represent what we found. Okay, and so this here, when you have, I know we've talked about single subject experimental research. That's on the quantitative side. You also have single subject research. You also have single subject qualitative research, which we really didn't talk about. Most of the single subject actually is done on the qualitative side than on the quantitative side. And this here was an attempt to create a code book for a project that I did. This was back when I was a graduate student at Ohio State University, to do a code book for a single subject, individual. And so here, if you see the legend here, JC, that's me. OR, I can't remember what her name was. Ophelia Ramirez, I think, if I recall correctly. It was a long time ago, but I think I still remember. And so these were the codes that we did once I did the interview, I transcribed it and did the analysis. This is ultimately what we found. The interview was about, how does, what is her experience in higher education as a Latina woman in the Midwest? And so there were opportunities to succeed that she had at the university, motivation. She also had a little bit of identity crisis because she was still struggling with understanding her Latina identity. It's not something that she really grew up with. Past experiences and reliability of the study. So this is sort of an attempt to try to ultimately write it up. This would be the process or the direction, the structure in which we would write it up. It would probably have 5 different sections in the paper. And ultimately, I think that's what I had. But it's all based on the codes and how they were organized and based on what we found or what I found. Okay. So the data analysis, you want to also do it during the data collection. Not a lot of times you don't want to wait till the very end to begin your data analysis. You want to do it throughout because sometimes you may find something in a particular instrument or a question that you're asking that you may need to modify, and so you kind of don't want to really wait to the end to do that. You want to sort of do that throughout so that you're able to make those changes. And so particularly if sometimes if you're a single researcher, which most of you will probably work as individuals in your project, you want to do pre and post interview field notes, re-examine the interviews, all your protocols, your memos. Sometimes if you're working in teams, you want to do post-research interviews. You do an interview and then your team gets together and they record a discussion about what you found or, how that interview or focus group went. And you record that and that becomes part of your data. The key thing in data analysis, especially if you're doing it throughout the data collection, is to be careful not to jump to conclusions and thinking what you're going to find. Always keep an open mind. I know I've been talking a lot about the workforce study. Well, it's not just me working on that study, it's a whole team of people, but there are some people that are leaders in this team that already believe from the very beginning, that they knew what they were going to find. And that's kind of dangerous. I've been kind of warning them that that's really dangerous. Why are we doing a study if you already know what you're going to find, right? Is it really just to affirm what you're going to find? Well, you have to keep telling them that you have to have an open mind. Just because you think you're going to find something doesn't mean that that's what you're going to find. Okay. All right. So this is really kind of documenting. This is a study that I did on faculty. This is really documenting the post-research interviews, right? So if you see like F1, F2, F3, those are the actual interviews. If you see the time, those are long. Those are close to an hour, right? But if you have like F051, that means that there was a discussion after the 5th interview, 13 minutes, right? F062, 12 minutes. And so those also became part of the data, and we needed to have those to make sure we were on the right track. We didn't do them after every one, and they didn't need to be done after every one. We just needed, uh, a nice sort of cut of the data or a piece of the data to affirm and to see if we needed to make any changes to our protocols. And this is how it was documented. Okay. There's also data collection, data analysis after data collection, and that's actually the majority of the analysis, right? Um, how do you know where to start, right? And these are the way I'm talking about these is really from the easiest to the more complex, right? You ask 5 questions to 5 people, you separate them out. Okay, question one, you put all the voices of all the people that answered question one, and you analyze that as question one. That's pretty easy to do. It doesn't take a lot of thinking to do something like that. It's really just cut and paste, or depending on what program you're using, right? Then you have themes, right? Maybe you had themes like I did for the Men and Boys of Color project, and you want to organize um, all your findings under themes. This takes a little bit more time to do because when they answer one question, they may be talking about two or three different themes. So you have to cut different pieces of that and put them inside your themes. Ultimately, and this is really it's a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more real, a little bit more authentic, but it takes a little bit more time. Okay. Then you have the literature review. You may have done an exhaustive literature review and found 5 different themes that are going to be key that you probably created your protocols based on those themes. Well, now you want to use those themes and you want to do your coding and your analysis based on those themes as organizing buckets for your study. You may have theory, concepts in the theory, like I did for the Men and Boys of Color project when I used LabCrit. Use those concepts as major sort of buckets for how you're going to break up and interpret the data. It could be chronological order. It could be from scratch. I know we haven't talked a lot about grounded theory, but grounded theory, essentially the idea is you start from scratch. You don't have any preconceived notions or even any preconceived ideas or themes. You basically just start looking at the data and you're like, okay, what does this mean? You create a theme from scratch, and ultimately you create a lot of themes, and ultimately you need to package them together. So if we go back to the tree analogy, it's like you're finding a bunch of leaves laying on the ground, and you want to pick them up, and then you're like, okay, these are a little bit more green, or these are a little bit bigger. These are for maybe this tree or that tree, and you want to separate them out, and ultimately you want to find some branches and glue them to those branches, and then get all of those branches and glue them to a larger trunk. So you're kind of going backwards. Instead of going from the trunk to the leaf, you're going from the leaf all the way to the trunk. Okay. Okay. Transcriptions. There's 3 different ways to do transcriptions, right? If you're going to use grounded theory, which we talked about, you need to do a verbatim transcription, right? You need to really ultimately transcribe everything as it was said, right? But maybe for a thematic analysis, you have your notes, and your notes could be like a first level cut, a first level analysis of your themes, especially if you had enough notes or enough post interview discussions or post focus group discussions to say, okay, I think I know the 7 or 8 different themes, and that's how we're gonna use those as organizing buckets for all the data. Or it could really be the voice file, right? And I've been doing quite a bit of that for a lot of the projects that I have. And Vivo allows you to do that, to listen to the file and tag the file. Okay, from here to here is this theme. From here to here is this theme. So if you watch the video on NVivo, it might have gone over that and how you transcribe and how you create themes from the voice files. Okay, steps in analyzing qualitative research. You got to read the transcripts over and over again. You got to become very familiar with the transcripts to know what it is that you're finding, what is in there. You got to sort of develop a relationship, if you will, with those transcripts. You read them once, it may give you some direction of how you're going to code. But the more you read them, the more you understand what does this mean and how are you going to write this up? How are you going to organize this? Okay, you got to describe. After the first read, you begin to develop a framework for the data, insights. Uh, what does this mean? How are we going to organize it? You know, what are all the different procedures that we used to collect that data? And then you classify under visual models or pictures, such as the ones I showed you. You know, sometimes these could get complex. They can have, 7, 800 different boxes. I mean, that's really for like a dissertation. You probably wouldn't do any projects that had that many, but you could have 50, 60, 100, right? You consider doing an outline, consider sort of historical linear models. Like, if you're doing school stuff, what happened in elementary, then what happened in middle school, then after that, high school, and maybe after that, college, right? Basic structures, pluses and minuses, right? Things that are, opportunities and challenges. That's always a good way to look at things of in terms of how it's affecting human behavior. Be clear, open, systematic, right? Especially if you have a lot of codes. The better organized you are, the better. If you have to be running through, 80, 90 codes every time you are trying to code, a new interview under that structure that you've developed. Okay, then you identify themes. What are the themes? How are we going to use those themes to, to write up, our analysis? And I just, for myself, I have this sort of 100 line of data minute maximum, right? So what does that mean, right? So say you're finding a lot of things on institutional racism in the document. Everybody's talking about institutional racism. You're starting to code everything under institutional racism. Well, at some point you have too much data, right? You have 50 pages on institutional racism. Well, my sort of maximum is once you have 100 lines of data under institutional racism, you got to reread all of it to see if there's nuances and all of that. Like, is there any way to split it up even further? Maybe we want to talk about institutional racism at the university, institutional racism in the community or in community organizations to have a little bit of a better sense of have something a little bit more manageable that you can work with. So you need to develop where am I going to have a break point where I need to sort of develop further nuance in those codes. Okay. So coding free codes, free codes are the idea of, okay, when you're doing maybe like grounded theory, you want to go find the leaves and then you start categorizing the leaves. But at some point you have leaves that you don't know what branch you're going to connect them to. They're free, they're out there. And then you have multi-layer codes, right? Many different branches working at the same time. You're developing them at the same time. Sometimes this could get really complex. And then for that, what I usually use is this qualitative data analysis software called NVivo. Links there for you to link on that and go watch some really good videos, actually. I just watched them last night. And those are going to help explain a little bit more of how NVivo works. And I usually recommend students to use NVivo if it's something where they're going to have a lot of data, maybe over 100 pages of data. If you're not going to have that much data, then probably investing in a program like this wouldn't be a good idea. Okay, data interpretation, right? It really comes down, the interpretation comes down to the meaning that you give the data. And I just kind of give you an example here. This was one of the very first studies that I did back when I was a doctoral student, right? We were studying Latinos in theological education. And we coined this term inspirational mentors because we knew what mentors were, but inspirational mentors, as we were interviewing these faculty, they all were pointing, well, these are my mentors, but these aren't people that they had ever had a relationship with, or sometimes even not even met, but they were mentors because of what they had written. The books they had written had inspired them to go into that field, and they were trying to sort of follow in their footsteps based on their academic record, right? And we that's something we had never seen, because we had never seen a mentorship relationship like that where people hadn't met each other. And so we call that inspirational mentors. And, we actually wrote a paper on that. So uh, the categories that are created need to be, defined by the research, so that the research doesn't, lose the meaning over time. Categories need to be created to conceptually represent the data, right? And so here's another example on a study that I did, right? As you have, like, remember I talked about the trunk is connected to large branches that are connected to small branches that are connected to leaves. So this was opportunities to succeed, right? Under opportunities to succeed, we had financial opportunities, opportunities to get involved in education, opportunities to learn the culture. Those are the subcategories. And each one of these had branches to it. So if we take financial opportunities, we had financial aid, scholarships, and work related opportunities, right? So we're just showing really a slice. Ultimately, this coding structure, there was maybe 600 codes. I'm just showing you here 5 or 6 codes to give you an idea of how the trunk is connected to large branches that are connected to smaller branches that are connected to leaves. Okay. All right. Ultimately, you have to weigh, you must weigh the weight of the data. What does that mean? So back to this stuff on studying gangs, and I actually have studied, sort of done some research on gangs. So I'm not just, using that example without having done some research on it. But okay, so say you're studying how gangs operate in schools, right? And you start talking to kids. Well, maybe a lot of the gang members really don't want to talk to you, right? But maybe those that are friends or neighbors of gang members, that may be the majority of your interviews, right? But at some point, maybe a gang leader or somebody that isn't a gang decides to talk to you, right? Well, in our perspective, that person would carry more weight, right? Because if we're learning about gang activity in schools, it's best to talk to gang members as opposed to people that are friends or that know gang members, right? And so, as a researcher, you have to be able to understand that some voices may carry more weight than other voices, and finding a way to label those quotes or to label that research that is going to provide, more emphasis on those voice. Um, who are you as a person, researcher, individual, cultured person, professional? Has a lot to do with how you interpret the findings, right? If you're sort of, back to this issue of gangs, right? If you grew up among gangs, and gang members were your neighbors, and they weren't trying to harm you, or you know in any way, then you may not look negatively upon gang members. You may think they're just a part of society. But maybe if you were maybe, victimized by a gang member, you may have very negative views of gang members, right? So who you are, your culture, all of that you bring to the table does carry some weight in terms of how you interpret some of that data. And so the key thing is to really do try to leave your biases at the door as much as possible. We know that it's kind of almost impossible to do that, but it is our responsibility as researchers to uh, make a very strong attempt to enter research and data analysis in a non-biased way, if that makes any sense. Considering the literature, knowledge, theories to interpret the findings, but not to try to fit your findings into paradigms, right? Just because you have a theory or you have, literature themes, maybe all of the data that you have doesn't fit so nicely into that. Well, that's something that you have to also say as well. You have to say, how does your findings fit what we already know? And how do you add new knowledge? Or how do you maybe challenge the existing knowledge, right? One idea may be this concept of machismo, right? The idea or the belief is that, oh, well, if you're a Latino male, you must be, a machista, or, I don't know if everybody knows what that means, but, well, maybe at some point that was the case. At some point that has to be re-examined and say, oh, wait a minute, that really doesn't exist anymore. It's still in the literature. People still believe that. It's maybe, based on old studies or based on stereotypes, but maybe that's not really the case anymore. And so that's why sometimes it's important to sort of challenge old ideas or old paradigms with new data so that so that we bring the culture and our knowledge up to date. Okay. All right. Ensuring credibility, you have to be ethical and put the meaning of the data over any personal or political beliefs that we talked about, as we talked about. So you got to say yes to these questions for credibility. Are your findings supported by the data? You can't say you found something and not have any data to back it up. You have to have data to back it up, right? Is the data triangulated? Did you triangulate? Did you collect different sources of data? Can you trust the data to the point of view that it represents the social phenomenon under investigation? Did you establish rapport? Were there any biases, any limitations? Were they explained, right? Were they reported? Okay. And this is really an example of, potentially some limitations in qualitative research. The researcher bias, you have too many biases and you weren't able to leave those at the door. Your credibility maybe is limited. You're trying to write about something you know very little about or haven't studied enough. Sample size bias, potentially. You're trying to maybe make some vast generalizations with really small sample sizes. Transferability. Does your study, what you found, can we use that in other similar settings? Triangulation, were you able to triangulate your data? Sample selection bias. What type of sampling method did you use? And, based on that sampling method, did you appropriately select the right participants for your study? Sample selection limitations, right? Transferability, similar thing. Transferability, right? Were you able to? Is there a high level of transferability in your study? Interviewee dynamics, right? You may be interviewing LGBT members, but you're not part of that community, right? You may not have an understanding truly what they're going through if you don't have that lived experience, and so that could provide a limitation. And then power perception limitations. This happens a lot when principals try to do research and they try to interview their teachers. Well, it's kind of hard for a teacher to be authentic and real with a principal that is also outside of the research and maybe their supervisor. And so there's some limitations there in terms of, power differentials. So, okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for a wonderful semester. And I look forward to getting, your final work.